In 1976, gentle giant Tom Nevin married an ambitious young woman, 10 years his junior.
Catherine Nevin was a self-made woman who basically came from nothing.
As business partners, the couple looked wildly successful, but behind closed doors, their marriage was violent and abusive.
Tom was actually a battered husband and he was hospitalised several times.
Violence against men by women wasn't really talked about back then the way it is now.
When Tom Nevin was murdered, his wife played the grieving widow to a T, but only she stood to benefit from the wealthy man's death.
He owned several properties and he had several life insurance policies.
Who stands to gain from Tom's death? The more it was looked at, the more it was realised that it was Catherine.
Catherine Nevin had been exposed as one of the world's most evil killers. In the year 2000, Catherine Nevin's trial at Dublin's Central Criminal Court for her husband Tom's murder had the press and the public captivated and horrified in equal measure.
It was Ireland pre-divorce, pre-abortion, and the idea of a woman who was so ambitious that she would plot for 10 years to kill her husband. It just gripped everyone's imagination. She broke the mould.
Nevin's carefully curated wardrobe and glamorous looks inspired fevered analysis in the press.
She was dubbed the Black Widow, but they were overly concerned with how Catherine Nevin was dressed, her demeanour in court and how she acted. Judge Marital did say to the media that they do have a right to report on cases, but this would not outweigh Catherine Nevin's right to a fair trial.
Marital had to ask the journalists to please stop commenting on her outfits and her shoes and her hair.
They even restricted taking photographs of her coming in and out of court.
Catherine Nevin's trial for murder was in keeping with a life in which she'd frequently courted attention and drama. This killer's story begins on the 1st of October 1950 in the east of Ireland.
Catherine Nevin was born in 1950 in a small village in Ballydonna in Nerney in County Kildare.
I visited the house and it was like it literally had a tin roof on the house, so it's quite sort of modest start in life.
Author Niamh O'Connor has researched Catherine Nevin's life, starting with her childhood, when she was known by her maiden name of Catherine Scully.
She had a sister and a brother. They looked like a close family. Unusually for the time, she did her leaving cert. Most people left after their inter-cert, so she must have been quite clever to have got to that point. After school, she did a secretarial course.
She went to Dublin to work in the Castle Hotel, one of the oldest in the city. She was young, glamorous, and ambitious.
Catherine Scully moved to Dublin in 1969. A year or so later, she met Tom Nevin, her future husband, at a festival in the town of Lisdoonvarna in County Clare.
It's a traditional matchmaking festival that goes on down in the south of Ireland, and it's well attended, and it's always good fun and good crack. Tom was the oldest of 9 children from a little farming background in Tyna in County Galway.
Tom had married young and moved to England, but when that didn't work out, he'd returned to Ireland and settled in Dublin, where he was running a pub for his uncle.
Tom was on his way to becoming very wealthy. He had a portfolio of property that he bought. Catherine would have been aware that he was doing nicely. He was building up a sizable bank account.
Tom was a very physically tall man. He was 6'3" or 4".
Very quiet, affable, but easily manipulable. And I think that's what appealed to the young Catherine Nevin, who saw him as an opportunity to further her ambitions. And so they formed a relationship.
Tom Nevin managed to get his first marriage annulled And in January 1976, 34-year-old Tom and Catherine Scully, who was 25, were married in Rome. But before the wedding had taken place, she'd done something highly unusual.
Before marrying Tom, Catherine impersonated a social worker and she went to the home of Tom's former wife to try and get information from her about Tom.
And she asked her very intimate questions, like just to make sure she knew everything about him.
It's incredibly manipulative. It's almost stalking behaviour, and I think it's quite concerning.
Satisfied that her spouse was the right man to help further her ambitions, the newlywed Catherine Nevin wasted no time in launching a range of money-making ventures.
They were living in Marital in Dublin, and Catherine was always very well presented, well-dressed and well-groomed, and she started lecturing in beauty deportment and dabbled in modelling school from her home in Marital.
Actually, vanity was always kind of a feature in her life.
In the early 1980s, Nevin persuaded her husband Tom that it was time to expand their business empire.
He would have been happy to have, according to people who knew him, remained a barman for the rest of his life. But Catherine wanted the premises. She wanted, to be the boss.
Their first venture was in a public house in the Finglas area of Dublin.
They got the pub in Finglas, which had been previously subjected to arson attacks and a lot of antisocial problems.
I think it was there that she first got a taste for Irish politics, Sinn Féin officers, and indeed paramilitaries, because it was a focal point.
It was in Finglas that Catherine Nevin would meet some of the men who would later loom large in her and her husband's story. The first, in 1985, was convicted criminal Jerry Heaps.
He was a man who was in the IRA, who had served time as an IRA prisoner. 10 years he served for armed robbery. And when he was released from prison, he was working in an office attached to the Sinn Féin constituency office, making things that could be sold to raise funds for the Republican prisoners.
Above the Sinn Féin Advice Centre was a TV repair shop run by an associate of Heaps, a Sinn Féin councillor called John Jones.
Catherine Nevin used to go and visit John Jones in the local Sinn Féin office to discuss business matters with him. And as a sort of quid pro quo, she allowed Sinn Féin to distribute their newspaper in the Finglas pub.
It was around this time in 1985 that cracks in Tom and Catherine's 9-year marriage first began to show, when Mrs. Nevin met a man called Willie McLean.
Willie McLean was a criminal. He'd been involved in fraud and deception, perhaps smuggling alcohol.
He was quite a murky character, Willie, because he was a Protestant. He was interested in unionism and loyalism.
I think Catherine Nevin enjoyed the company of men she regarded as dangerous. And there were quite a lot of those around, not just the paramilitaries, but also criminals. There was something that gave her a frisson of excitement.
According to him, she was sitting at the bar drinking and he went up and started chatting her up, and they had an affair.
By the time she'd embarked on the affair with William McLean, she regarded Tom as useless, partly because he was a bit too quiet and a bit too gentle and not nearly exciting enough.
He was a good businessman, he was a good business head, but he obviously got in her way.
Nevin's affair with McLean, brazenly flaunted for her husband and the rest of the world to see, was also confusing for those who knew what kind of men she'd been associating with since her move to Dublin.
You have Catherine, on the one hand, interested in republicanism, on the other hand, having a relationship with a man on the other side of, that whole sectarian divide.
Was Nevin deliberately making contacts with men rumoured to have criminal or paramilitary connections in the hopes they could be useful to her in the future? Her affair with Willie McLean was just one sign of the difficulties she and her husband were having. 9 years into their marriage, accusations of alcohol abuse and violence had also begun to swirl.
The marriage was marred by a lot of alcohol. Tom liked to drink and Catherine liked to drink, and they were in an environment where drink was ever flowing.
Catherine always maintained that Tom was a silent alcoholic, that he hid it well from the public, but that she suffered as a result.
Catherine Nevin complained to her male friends that her husband would beat her up after drinking. In reality, however, it was Catherine, not Tom, who was capable of violence. Despite their marital difficulties, in the spring of 1986, the Nevins set their sights on a new business venture.
I suppose Nevin had always got higher ideals and higher aspirations and wanted to maybe move to a more salubrious part of the country, and they settled on Jack White's, which they bought for a tidy sum at the time. I think it was about in the order of 270,000.
The draw of Jack White's pub was that it was in an area, British Bay, County Wicklow, which was where people with holiday homes went.
It's a long, long sandy beach. Nice summer's day, you could be forgiven for thinking that you were in Spain or what, Costa del Sol or one of these places.
It was on the road south from Dublin, and people who were driving south would stop for lunch. And they had a very good carvery. It was a very good place to stop.
At the grand opening of their new business in March 1986, Catherine Nevin aimed to make an impression.
Naturally enough, Catherine Nevin wanted to make a stir. She invites all the people she knows from Dublin. William McLean is there. A man called Jerry Heaps is there with his wife, and also makes sure that she gets all the local dignitaries that she knows.
I think Catherine was always sort of interested in your status, and so, for instance, if the local judge came into the pub, he would be given special treatment and feel the full sort of effect of her charms.
I think Catherine had a personality type where she wanted to get wherever she wanted to go, and whoever was there to help her, good, bad or indifferent, she would use them to her advantage.
She courted the local Garda officers, both on and off duty. They'd be in the bar getting freebies and having drinks.
She would be behind the bar in her silk dressing gown and would be quite revealing, and, you know, she had two little I call them handbag dogs, but you know, like fluffy dogs that were fed Kit Kats.
One of the other things that set Catherine Nevin apart was she had cosmetic surgery. She had eye lifts and fat removal and a tummy tuck. Most unusual in Ireland at that time, because she wanted to be glamorous and attractive and a real figure.
In terms of the roles in the pub, Tom would have been behind the bar and Catherine was very much like the hostess out, sort of meeting and greeting. Now, I say that, but people would fall foul of her, and she was regularly sort of barring people. She would bar indiscriminately for the most, like, ridiculous reasons. She would just take a dislike to someone and that would be it.
For staff who worked at Jack White's, the contrast between Nevin and her husband Tom soon became apparent.
Tom Nevin would have been known to all his staff and anybody that was in the pub as a gentle giant.
He was the kind of man who, for instance, if staff needed advances on their wages, had no problem sort of giving it to them. He never humiliated anyone. He always was very respectful of the staff, so people really loved him in the area. Across the board, nobody had any sort of time for Catherine. She was very abusive. She would scream and shout. There was this huge difference between the two characters. There was a source of fascination how these two ever got together.
By the time the couple moved to British Bay, Catherine Nevin's marriage to Tom was increasingly volatile.
Catherine could be very, very violent and abusive towards him. And when Catherine was drinking, she was especially violent. They saw Catherine throw an ashtray across the bar at him one time. He was regularly sort of whacked by her.
We have to remember that this was Ireland in the 1980s. So the understanding that men could be victims of domestic violence was something that just wasn't spoken about. I think men would have found it shameful. It was a very kind of misogynistic, traditionalistic kind of culture that was going on for everybody back in the 80s, not just in Ireland. If you can't handle your woman, what kind of a man are you? That's not how we think about it now.
Tom Nevin was a very private man. He hated gossip. So there might have been an element where this would have been a second failed marriage, and Tom might have been very embarrassed about admitting that to everybody.
Staff remembered one occasion when Tom had locked himself into the gents' toilet and could not be persuaded to come out. And an ambulance was called for him, but he refused to leave in it.
On several occasions, Tom did end up in hospital due to the assaults he got from Catherine Nevin.
As the years passed, Catherine Nevin's aggression continued. Local Gardaí may not have been aware of the violence, but they did have frequent reason to visit the pub on official business.
Catherine made a very high number of allegations about crime, so there was always investigations in the pub. So the local guards would have been in and out taking statements, you know, because she made a huge number of insurance claims as well on the property, you know, for items disappearing and so on.
The multiple reports of criminal activities and insurance claims by Catherine Nevin caused the guards to be suspicious of insurance fraud, although I don't think any charges were brought against her.
Despite moving out of Dublin in pursuit of the high life, Nevin had not lost her taste for fraternising with members of the criminal underworld.
Dutchie Holland, who also lived in British Bay, was going in and sitting at the bar and talking to Catherine.
Dutchie Holland was a career criminal from the inner city who would have had a lot of associations with members of criminal gangs.
For an organised gangland figure of that kind of calibre to be sort of networking with Catherine meant that she had sort of contacts.
Local Gardaí called to Jack White's Inn one morning in 1996 would certainly have felt like big city crime had suddenly arrived in beautiful British Bay.
The 18th of March 1996 was significant in that it was the 10th year anniversary of their acquiring the pub. It was also a bank holiday weekend.
It was St. Patrick's weekend. It was a very busy weekend.
There were guest rooms in the pub where Catherine Nevin often allowed her employees to stay after a late shift. But the 18th of March 1996 was different.
The staff were going to a dance in Arklow, 7 or 8 miles away, and were expecting to return to the pub to sleep. She tells the staff, "Sorry, you can't stay here tonight."
The next anyone heard from Catherine Nevin was at 4:30 the following morning, when a panic button at the pub was pressed, alerting the local Garda station to a possible problem.
When the guards arrived, about 4:30 in the morning of the 19th of March, they found Catherine behind the hall door, on the floor, slumped, and the back door open.
Catherine was dishevelled when the Gardaí arrived on the scene. She had a dressing gown rope tied around her arms. She had managed to free her legs. She'd been gagged.
When the guards got to Catherine Nevin, they took the gag off, released her hands. She gave every impression of being in a state of shock. Her eyes rolled back. She said her shoulder hurt.
Dressed in a purple nightshirt, 45-year-old Nevin claimed to have been awoken by a hooded man who'd pushed her face into the pillow and threatened her with a knife, demanding to know where she kept her jewellery.
She said she heard the sound downstairs of like a pot dropping, and that she could smell gunshot residue.
Then she asked, "Where's Tom?" Tom Nevin was found in the kitchen. He was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, with a single gunshot wound to his side.
He's clearly dead, and he was just 54 years old.
There was no sign of forced entry, nor that there'd been a struggle. At first glance, all the signs suggested Tom had been killed in a botched robbery. As the only other person in the building when Tom was shot dead, Catherine Nevin was the only person who could give Gardaí any clues that would lead them to her husband's killer.
When you'd go to a murder scene, you would round up whoever is there and capture their account straight away. Catherine was very vague about what had happened when it came down to it. She had heard a loud bang. She had heard the two cars leaving, but she wasn't of any great assistance as to what actually had occurred.
People can be quite distressed and shocked if they witness a murder, particularly the murder of their husband. It's completely understandable that she would have been so distraught that she couldn't give a statement. However, it is unusual that somebody who have had their husband murdered didn't want to give a statement to the Gardaí, because surely you'd want to give them every tiny piece of information that you can think of, particularly when it's fresh in your mind.
After Tom's death, Catherine did behave in a way that people found suspicious or unusual. She didn't want to go to the hospital and have her injuries checked.
When you go to a scene like that and somebody is saying that they were tied up and all the rest, your first instinct is to look at the wounds, look for the ties.
Gardaí were suspicious of the fact that there were no bind marks on Catherine's ankles, although her wrists certainly did have binds on them. Her ankles were not marked.
Two Gardaí called for experienced forensic experts to attend what clearly appeared to be a murder. As they waited, they noticed some unexpected features of the scene.
There was £15,550 taken, the family car was taken, but her jewellery, none of it was taken.
The jewellery that the raiders were so interested in was placed down the stairs and was in a trail out to a ditch, so they never actually took it in the end.
Although Catherine insisted she'd, been attacked in her bedroom and the drawers had been ransacked. In fact, they hadn't been yanked out. They'd been very carefully taken out by the sides. Far from it being chaos, her lipstick was standing straight up on her dressing table.
There were some odd features, too, of Tom's blood-soaked body. For a start, he was cold to the touch.
Which suggested that actually Tom had died a lot earlier, that it had taken a serious amount of time before she set off that panic alarm. His glasses were on his face, and the pathologist reckoned that the force of the shot would have been such that that could not have happened unless they were placed back there.
It was clear that Tom Nevin was taken by surprise and that he had no defensive wounds. It's said that he may have been conscious for perhaps 30 seconds after he was shot, but would have bled out and died within 5 minutes.
Later that morning, Nevin threw out suggestions to detectives about what might have happened to Tom.
She claimed that he had been followed when he was taking the money to the bank, the suggestion being that, this robbery had been planned for some time by criminals.
Oh, there were some very odd people who came into the kitchen last week. They told her they were looking for the loo, but in fact they were actually casing the joint.
She claimed that there'd been an attempted break-in at the pub and that she had seen this brown Renault, outside.
Nevin seemed keen to throw suspicion on potential suspects in her husband's death, but she was not always as helpful to investigators.
In trying to establish the amount of cash that was stolen, Gardaí would have gone back to receipts on tills and things like that to see how much money was coming in.
She was refusing to hand over till rolls, which would have, aided the investigation. The guards wanted to recreate some of the claims that Catherine had made about being able to smell gunpowder in her bedroom. And so they wanted to basically discharge a shot and see if the smell would travel, had she lied or not. She absolutely point blank refused.
Increasingly suspicious of the so-called grieving widow, Garda officers continued to investigate, while Catherine Nevin quickly made arrangements to bury her husband.
There was a huge turnout at Tom's funeral. There was real shock and upset in the community over the death of this man who had provided employment, a friend to people in the area, and people were very upset by it. Catherine carried a rose and a sort of a lace handkerchief. The people who were there felt that she was acting a part.
Catherine would have the Gardaí believe that she had a good, solid marriage, that everything was honky-dory.
When detectives began interviewing friends, family, staff and customers, a different story quickly emerged.
It soon became revealed that their marriage was not good, that there was violence in that marriage, and the violence was coming from Catherine to Tom, and that Catherine was having affairs.
Nevin, whose fling with Dublin associate Willie McLean had ended in late 1986, was later believed to have had extramarital relationships with at least 2 other men.
When you start digging into somebody's life, you're going to be looking for motive. Who had a motive to kill Tom? That's one of the key questions. It was found through this process when they were investigating Tom's life that really he didn't have any enemies. He was a popular man, he was kind, he was gentle. It was Catherine who was the problem.
If infidelity wasn't motive enough, Gardaí soon uncovered another reason Nevin might want her husband dead.
The months prior to Tom's murder, Catherine had taken out a massive life insurance policy on his unexpected demise, and so she was set to, cash in on, I think it was over 100 grand as a result of her husband's murder.
Tom had amassed quite a considerable amount of money in his property and dealings, and there was no children there. There was only one sole benefactor, and that was Catherine. So it's all sort of stacking up against Catherine very early on.
There was one problem with the theory that Catherine Nevin may have killed her husband to get her hands on his fortune. At the time of his death, her hands appear to have been tied very firmly behind her back. Nevin had the motive and the opportunity to kill Tom, but perhaps not the means to pull the trigger herself. Then, 24 days after Tom's murder, the Garda made a discovery that was a blast from Catherine Nevin's past.
When Gardaí searched Catherine's bedroom and took various items for further tests, they found in a contacts book names that rang bells. One of them was Jerry Heaps, whose number had been scratched out.
Heaps was the former IRA prisoner from Finglas, whom Nevin had invited, along with his wife, to the grand opening of Jack White's Inn 10 years earlier.
But Catherine denied ever knowing or meeting Jerry Heaps.
Suspicion was strong that Nevin had been involved in her husband's murder, and that perhaps she had an accomplice, but the Garda had no way of proving it.
There certainly wasn't enough evidence to go to the DPP just from the crime scene, from the pathologist's report. The Gardaí needed some sort of corroboration, somebody to come forward and say, yeah, you're on the right lines.
Catherine Nevin was arrested in July for possession of a firearm. It wasn't suspected at any time that this actually was the murder weapon. However, they decided to arrest her due to the licence being expired.
They believed that she had Tom murdered, and they couldn't bring her in for questioning on murder without a warrant. And to get the warrant, they needed really, substantial evidence that she was a suspect. So they used this technicality of this unauthorised firearm to bring her in to see if they could get her to crack. Obviously, she knew better and she refused to talk. She knew what was going on. This was the dance.
Nevin was held for 48 hours. She refused food and did not answer any questions. Detectives were no closer to finding out exactly what had happened to innocent publican Tom Nevin, nor to proving who'd killed him. Then, in December 1996, almost 9 months after Tom's murder, 2 men from Catherine Nevin's Finglas past came out of the woodwork with a jaw-dropping story.
John Jones and Jerry Heaps both came forward to say that they had been solicited by Catherine over a long period of time to kill Tom.
Jerry Heaps told the Garda that Catherine Nevin used to visit him regularly in his Finglas office. He said to the guards that despite her moving to Wicklow, she continued to visit him on regular occasions. She had asked Heaps on 10 occasions to murder Tom, and she even went as far as to suggest ways that he could do it.
He said he went out with her on multiple occasions. He visited the house of flats that Tom rented, where Catherine showed him how he could, suddenly jump out and surprise Tom and kill him.
She also suggested to him quite elaborately that perhaps he would do it while they were at dinner together so that she could have Tom dying in her arms, no doubt to be used as an alibi for the solicitation.
Nevin then said she wanted Tom killed in the pub to make it look like a robbery, and that she could pay the killer up to £40,000.
Around the same time, Nevin was meeting with John Jones. She told him that her husband was a violent drunk and beat her up and asked him to kill him.
So she went into a local politician's clinic looking to have her husband murdered by a Sinn Féin councillor. It's incredible that she would be so brazen as to even ask.
Both men had refused Nevin's request. Neither of them had reported her scheme at the time, nor had they warned Tom Nevin about the plot on his life. But as suspicion against Catherine Nevin grew in the months after Tom's death, Nevin's associates were coming under intense scrutiny.
We were interviewed and realised that the net was closing in on them and that it was better to cooperate than be found as a suspect.
Catherine Nevin's longtime associates had turned on her, a devastating blow to her claims of innocence in the murder of her husband Tom. Then a third man went to detectives, one with whom Nevin had had a torrid affair some 10 years earlier. In 1990, Catherine Nevin was in hospital in Dublin and asked her former lover, Willie McLean, to visit her. When he did, he was met with a disturbing offer.
She approached William McLean and said something along the lines that there's 20 grand in it for you to get rid of Tom.
Just like the other two men, McLean had firmly refused to help Nevin kill her husband. In fact, he was horrified at the request.
I think it's an arrogance in her that she probably thinks everybody thinks like her, and when actually they don't. I think she's probably quite cold, probably without remorse, and would just have assumed that these people were exactly the same.
The fact that 3 people came forward, it changed the game dramatically because here they were all saying more or less the same thing. They were all pointing the finger in the one direction. It was consistent.
Presented with these claims, Nevin simply told investigators to contact her lawyer. Months passed with no further developments. Tom Nevin's death was still officially unsolved, the culprit still on the loose.
The statements from these 3 men would allow and may support a charge for 3 solicitation charges, but not murder. And the problem with Catherine Nevin's case is they didn't have any clear smoking gun evidence.
In fact, investigators still had no murder weapon at all, nor any idea about who might have pulled the trigger.
And they were also worried because she had such contacts, and she was capable of anything, that they really feared that the case would never come to the courts.
Finally, more than a year after Tom Nevin was murdered, prosecutors were confident they had a case that would stick. They believed that the weight of circumstantial evidence, along with the corroborating statements of the 3 men, were sufficient to prove Catherine Nevin's guilt.
So on the 14th of April 1997, 13 months after Tom's death, Catherine was finally charged.
Today, members of the investigating team took Mr. Nevin's widow, Catherine, into custody. There, she was charged with the murder of her husband and with soliciting others to murder him in 1989 and 1990.
When Catherine Nevin's trial began at the Criminal Courts of Justice in Dublin on the 12th of January 2000, it was a media circus, as journalist Niamh O'Connor recalls.
The courtroom was packed every day. The case had absolutely captured the public imagination because, it was a female murderer, and that was very rare at the time.
She was a glamorous woman. She was, quite a confident woman. But that was overshadowing that this lovely man had been murdered. And perhaps it was actually taking away from the seriousness of what had happened.
After opening statements, the prosecution began to lay out their case against Catherine Nevin. But on the 26th of January, after dozens of witnesses had already taken the stand, the trial abruptly collapsed.
The first trial collapsed because the jurors overheard discussing the case. They mustn't discuss the case until all the evidence is heard so that they can go into the trial with an open mind and not having somebody convicted before they've heard all of the evidence.
The second trial was convened, and that was on the 8th of February 2000, and it collapsed because a member of the jury fell ill.
It was around this time that Catherine Nevin, who was out on bail, made another attempt to avoid facing trial for Tom's murder.
She claimed that someone had broken into her house and tried to kill her, and she was hospitalised as a result. Now bear in mind, this person who broke into the house did so while there was a guard guarding her property to make sure that nothing happened and she didn't try and evade justice.
Nevin claimed the attacker had threatened her and forced her to drink a milk-like liquid.
After she was hospitalised, the contents of her stomach were analysed, and the conclusion was that she had drunk water and fairy liquid to make herself sick. It was all very dramatic, all very unusual.
With Nevin's avoidance tactics thwarted, on the 14th of February 2000, the retrial finally began with a fresh jury.
It was one of the longest trials at the time in history. There were 170 witnesses. There were the state's main witnesses who claimed that Catherine had solicited them to kill Tom.
She gave contradicting evidence throughout the trial. She had multiple extramarital affairs. She had been openly violent towards Tom. So there was a huge credibility issue for Catherine Nevin, which then trying to deny the solicitation, that would have caused issues because it wasn't credible.
The motivation, according to the prosecution, was money. By some estimations, Nevin stood to gain up to £1 million from his death.
It's the oldest motive in the book. Take the money and get rid of Tom. In the early part of 1997, before she was arrested, she'd sold the pub for 3 times what they'd paid for it. I mean, she was now a rich woman, potentially.
She didn't want to leave Tom because that would have meant splitting her fortune. She wanted it all.
Catherine Nevin strongly denied a plot to have her husband killed. She said their marriage was happy, but she also made a range of false accusations against her late husband.
She called him an alcoholic. She called him paramilitary. He was an Irish Republican. In other words, to prove that he had a lot of enemies.
After a 6-week trial, one of the longest criminal trials in Irish legal history, the jury retired to consider their verdict.
The judge's direction had been very, very specific. You know, she had said that although there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, that circumstantial evidence should be regarded as like the strands in a rope, and that the more strands there are, the stronger the rope is.
For many in the courtroom, it was a long, tense wait for a verdict.
It took the jury 5 days, and that's 5 days for the investigation team, knowing that they've done the best that they can, but still, you know, did we do enough? Did we not do enough? Will there be a retrial?
Catherine Nevin showed no signs of apprehension about her fate.
I remember one day her barrister was, offering a coffee for her, to bring it back into the court while she was waiting there. And she turned around to me and she asked, would I like a coffee as well? And on other occasions, she was talking and joking about who would play her in the movie. So she was very, very relaxed. She absolutely believed that she was going to walk. 5 days in court is a long time when you are waiting, and when at any time, the knock can come on the jury door.
Just after 6:30, the atmosphere inside and outside the court was electrified as the jury announced their verdict.
The verdict was Catherine Nevin was found guilty of murder, and she was found guilty of the 3 solicitation charges.
Nevin got the mandatory life sentence for murder and 7 years for each of the soliciting charges to run concurrently.
She was in the women's wing of Mountjoy Prison in Dublin. Probably one of the most famous female prisoners in Irish legal history.
In 2003, she appealed her conviction. She alleged that Jack White's pub was an IRA pub, which tried to support her contention that he was killed by the IRA.
Catherine never accepted that she was guilty. Catherine always had a very high opinion of herself and always thought her high and mighty contacts or someone in a white horse would ride in and save the day.
She appealed again in 2010. She tried to get miscarriage of justice proved, and that too was turned down.
While continuing to protest her innocence, Nevin also pursued the fortune she believed was rightfully hers.
She did try, even while she was in prison, to get the property portfolio. She thought that she should inherit it as his wife, but thankfully Tom's family were able to challenge that, and Catherine failed in her quest to benefit from Tom's death.
Even if she had that money, what's she going to do with it? And a life sentence. What's she going to do with it? So some of this is about control and selfishness and resentment.
In August 2017, Nevin left prison to live out the last 6 months of her life.
Nevin was found to have a brain tumour and was terminally ill and was given compassionate release. She lived only a few months after she was released to a hospice, still maintaining her innocence.
In Dublin, Wicklow, and wherever Catherine Nevin's influence reached, the effects of her words and her actions are still being felt, not least for Tom Nevin's family.
The lies that she told and the lives that she wrecked in the process of sort of killing him, and the false trails of suspicion that she pointed at completely innocent people, were devastating.
I think there's an evilness about Catherine because she's so determined and seems to be so without any genuine concern for anybody but herself.
Dubbed the Black Widow by the media for her ruthless, predatory actions, Catherine Nevin has become a notorious figure. Determined from a young age to live a life of status and wealth, her husband Tom was perhaps seen as a stepping stone to success, then as an obstacle to the life she believed she deserved. Though convinced she could get away with murder, Nevin's brazen scheming left a trail of witnesses and ensured she will always be recognized as one of the world's most evil killers.